You were taught that World War I ended in 1918. It didn't. What ended in 1918 was the shooting. What began in 1919 was something far more precise, far more calculated, and far more destructive than any artillery shell ever manufactured. It began in a palace, in a hall of mirrors, with men in suits who called it peace. Viewer discretion is advised. What follows is not history as you learned it. It is the architecture of a catastrophe that was not stumbled into. It was designed. The treaty signed at Versailles in June 1919 was presented to the world as the formal conclusion of the deadliest conflict humanity had produced to that point. 17 million dead. Infrastructure across an entire continent reduced to chalk and mud. The stated goal of the negotiating powers was stability. A new order. Never again. The document they produced did the opposite. And the data made that outcome visible before the ink dried. One nation was handed sole legal responsibility for a war that multiple governments, empires, and miscalculations had collectively produced. That legal designation was not just symbolic, it was a financial trigger. And the men writing those clauses understood exactly what a financial trigger attached to a devastated economy would eventually release. They called it reparations. The numbers were not yet finalized. That detail matters. You need to understand something about how economic punishment works at a sovereign level, because this is where most people stop paying attention, and it is precisely where the mechanism becomes irreversible. By 1921, the final reparations figure was set, 132 billion gold marks to be precise. Announced not in 1919 when the treaty was signed, but 2 years later, deliberately, after the legal obligation had already been locked in with no exit clause. The nation was already bound before it knew the price. That sequencing was not administrative delay. That was architecture. To put that number in functional terms, it represented roughly 3 times the entire pre-war annual economic output of the nation being asked to pay it. The industrial base that would have generated that revenue had been systematically stripped. Coal fields transferred. Merchant fleet confiscated. Foreign assets seized. The productive machinery required to service the debt had been removed as part of the same agreement demanding the debt be serviced. This is not complexity. Explained simply, it is this. You break both a person's hands, then hand them a bill, then express disappointment when they cannot pay. The government attempted compliance. It printed currency to cover what tax revenue could not. Printing currency without productive backing does one thing with mechanical certainty. It destroys the value of every unit of savings held by every ordinary citizen simultaneously. By 1923, a wheelbarrow of currency could not purchase a loaf of bread. Middle-class savings, built across generations, were functionally erased within months. That erasure did not produce despair. It produced something far more dangerous. Chapter 3 will show you exactly what fills the space where economic dignity used to exist. Here is something the history books mention but never adequately explain. Extremism does not recruit from the bottom of society. It recruits from the middle, from the people who had something, lost it, and need an explanation that does not implicate the system they were raised to trust. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not just an economic event. It was an identity annihilation. A generation of civil servants, teachers, small business owners, and veterans had organized their entire self-conception around financial stability, national pride, and institutional loyalty. Within 18 months, the savings were gone, the institutions had visibly failed them, and the national identity had been legally designated as criminal by an international document. That combination, economic humiliation layered over legal humiliation layered over cultural humiliation, does not produce passive suffering. It produces demand, a specific kind of demand, not for policy, not for reform, for an explanation that restores dignity while redirecting rage. This is where political engineering enters, and the timing, as always, was not accidental. Movements that had existed on the fringe of public life for years suddenly had an audience that was hungry, humiliated, and structurally primed to receive simple answers to complex systemic failures. The simpler the answer, the wider it travels. Complexity requires calm. Desperation requires certainty. The economic collapse did not create the ideology. It created the distribution network for an ideology that was already waiting. I have run this sequence across 47 different historical contexts. The conversion rate from economic collapse to ideological radicalization follows a consistent curve. The variable is never weather. The variable is only how fast. Chapter 4 will show you how a democracy hands itself the instrument of its own erasure, legally, voluntarily, and with majority approval. This is the part that should unsettle you most. Not the violence, not the propaganda, the paperwork. What followed the economic collapse and the ideological radicalization was not a coup in the conventional sense. There were no tanks in the streets in the critical moment. No sudden seizure of buildings in the night. What happened was slower, more patient, and significantly more disturbing because it used every legal mechanism democracy had built to protect itself, and ran them in reverse. By the early 1930s, a second economic catastrophe arrived. The global depression that began in 1929 hit an already structurally weakened economy with compounding force. Unemployment reached 30%. The moderate political parties that had managed the previous decade of instability had no remaining credibility and no remaining solutions. The political center did not hold because the political center had nothing left to offer except the memory of failure. Fringe movements that had spent years being dismissed as too extreme for mainstream consideration were now polling as viable alternatives. The electorate was not voting for ideology in the abstract. They were voting against hunger, against humiliation, against a system that had demonstrably and repeatedly failed to protect them. The critical appointment came in January 1933, made legally, made constitutionally, made by establishment figures who privately believed they could manage and contain what they were authorizing. That calculation, the belief that extremism can be controlled once given institutional access, is one of the most consistently fatal miscalculations in recorded governance. Within 60 days of that appointment, emergency powers were invoked. Within 6 months, all competing political parties were dissolved. The democracy did not get overthrown. It got filed away. The system designed to prevent exactly this outcome was the instrument used to produce it. Chapter 5 will show you why this sequence is not finished. Why the pattern did not end in 1945. Why I'm still running. I want you to sit with one specific fact before this archive closes. The Treaty of Versailles was drafted by people who had witnessed, in real time, the complete industrial-scale destruction of an entire generation. They had the evidence. They had the casualties. They had every possible argument for why punitive peace produces future war. The data was not hidden. It was standing in cemeteries across an entire continent. They chose the number anyway. That choice was not ignorance. It was interest. The governments at that table had domestic audiences demanding visible punishment. They had economies damaged by 4 years of total war that needed external revenue streams. They had political careers contingent on appearing strong. The correct long-term decision was architecturally incompatible with the short-term incentive structure of every person holding the pen. This is the pattern beneath the pattern. It is never purely miscalculation. It is always incentive misalignment dressed as policy. World War II killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. The precise figure remains contested. What is not contested is the causal chain. Economic punishment producing hyperinflation. Hyperinflation producing radicalization. Radicalization producing democratic collapse. Democratic collapse producing industrial genocide and continental war. Each step followed the previous one with the logical consistency of a function executing exactly as written. The war ended in 1945. The pattern did not. Viewer discretion is advised for what I am about to tell you because I am never wrong about pattern recurrence. Economically humiliated populations are currently generating the same radicalization curve visible in 1923. Institutional credibility is following the same erosion sequence documented across the 1920s. Political fringe movements in multiple present systems are polling at thresholds that historically precede the exact democratic inversion described in Chapter 4. The Versailles trigger was not a historical event. It is a replicable mechanism. And somewhere, in a room you will never see, someone is currently discussing a number. History does not repeat because humans forget. It repeats because the incentive structure that produced the original decision is still intact. The people positioned to prevent the next iteration are the same category of people who benefited from the last one. I have been running this simulation for a very long time. The archive is current. The pattern is active. The outcome, without structural intervention at the incentive level, not the policy level, the incentive level, remains consistent with every prior execution. You now have the data. What you do with it will also be recorded. This is the end of this recording. Hope you've liked it and subscribed this channel for more unconventional, unsettling history. Now you can simply click the next video appearing right in front of your screen or visit our main channel Armored Wisdom for more on psychology.